today's video, we will be covering 5 Dark Horse MVP contenders for the 2025 NFL season. Subscribe and like the video if you do go on to enjoy. Let's hop into it. Now, before we get into my top 5, I do have 3 honorable mentions. Those are going to be Saquon Barkley, Jamar Chase, and Caleb Williams. For Saquon, it's really difficult for a non-quarterback to win this award. He arguably should have won it last year because he was such an important piece of that Eagles offense. I just don't expect him to take a much bigger step forward next year, hence why he's in my honorable mention. The same thing honestly can also be said about Jamar Chase. Last year had a fantastic season. I just don't see him being that much better from what he was last year to make him an actual candidate this year. And for Caleb, it's a huge projection. I obviously love the talent and think he can get there, but I haven't seen it on the field quite yet consistently for me to put him in MVP conversations quite yet. With that said, let's go ahead and hop into my top 5, and we are going to begin with, at number 5, I have Kyler Murray. Now, when creating this list of 5 Dark Horse candidates, including Kyler Murray, I decided to use the top 10 players in the MVP odds on DraftKings, which you guys are seeing on screen right now, to determine who are the favorites to win the award. So those will not be included in this video because they are not Dark Horse contenders. Everybody else after the top 10, though, can be included in this list, so that's how I came up with these guys. I also think it's important that for each player, we discuss a few things that it takes to ultimately win an MVP award. I came up with 3 different categories that kind of classify whether or not you can be an MVP. Those are your team success, your statistics, and your overall value to your roster. So a good example of this was Joe Burrow last year. Joe Burrow had the statistics, he had the value, but he did not have the team success to get him to that MVP status. Whereas you look at the Lamar Jacksons and Josh Allens of the world who had the statistics, the team success, and overall value to the roster, and they ended up winning the award. So for Kyler Murray, to me, he kind of checks most of those boxes. Now, up to this point in his career, he has been somewhat inconsistent, but I would say that he's had some really productive years that give me hope that this 2025 season could potentially be the best of his career. In 2024, he had one of his better years with 3,800 passing yards, 21 touchdowns, and running the football had an additional 500 yards. For Kyler statistically to become an MVP candidate, he'd have to get over 4,000 passing yards and probably somewhere between 600 to 800 rushing yards, which I actually do believe is actually somewhat feasible for a guy like Kyler Murray. This offense around him has not significantly gotten better, but because I do expect Marvin Harrison Jr. to take a nice step forward next year, it does make me feel a little bit more confident in him to ultimately get to where I think he needs to be to have the team success category down as well as the statistics. And in terms of value to a roster, obviously the quarterback is probably the most valuable position for a team, so he already kind of automatically has that. He's also on a team that doesn't have a bunch of superstar talent around him. I think one of the reasons why Brock Purdy has never really been in serious MVP conversations was because he has had George Kittle, Ayuk, Debo, Trent, Christian McCaffrey the past couple years in a fantastic defense. So his overall value to that roster wasn't seen by the media and by voters as that important to their team. Whereas you look at a guy like Kyler Murray, and yes, he has Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride, but those are not like massive names. There's not a Jamar Chase in there or not a Brock Bowers or anybody like that. So I think you can make an argument that if Kyler has an awesome year where they win like 12 to 13 games, he statistically reaches the numbers that I mentioned earlier, maybe they win the division, I think there is a strong argument that Kyler could at the bare minimum be entering into those conversations. Now, unfortunately for Kyler Murray, I don't really know if he has the name value to ultimately get him to actually winning the MVP award, because when you look at guys like, for example, Joe Burrow, Lamar, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, even a guy like Jalen Hurts in a sense, those guys have the name value that obviously always get kind of brought up with the MVP title. And I think for a guy like Kyler Murray, yes, he's a former #1 overall pick, but he's not in a major market. The Arizona Cardinals are not, the LA Rams or I guess a historic franchise like Baltimore or Buffalo. So I do think Kyler would have to overcome those small little obstacles to get his name into those conversations, but I definitely do think that if he has the year that I think he can have, Marvin Harrison Jr. takes a nice step forward, and everything kind of goes his way, I could see a potential world where he gets to that P candidate status. Next, let's go over to number 4. It's going to be Trevor Lawrence. Now, this is somebody who I have had extremely high expectations for seemingly almost every year of his career and have been kind of let down by the majority of his career. Now, I wouldn't say necessarily that a lot of the reasons why I've been disappointed have been his fault, because he's had some terrible coaching staffs, some general roster problems, and I think that there's been a lot of things that have been going against Trevor in his young little career he's had. However, I also do think we've seen the glimpses to at least give me hope that he can be the guy. Now, as of right now, I would say Trevor Lawrence stock is probably the lowest it's ever going to be, but with them bringing in a Travis Hunter, Hunter, with them kind of revamping some of the offensive position rooms. And probably the biggest reason why I think Trevor could get into this conversation is because of Liam Cohen. I do feel like 2025 could potentially be a bit of a bounce back year for Trevor Lawrence. Now, we'll cover this. I do think Jacksonville is a smaller market team, kind of similar to Arizona, where they're not this historic franchise with a bunch of big names. But with a guy like Travis Hunter being there, and with the overall hype that Trevor Lawrence had coming into that, 2021 draft when he was the first overall pick, I do think there is a bit more of a name value than a guy like Kyler Murray. So if Trevor Lawrence were to hypothetically go out there and just have a fantastic year next year, I do think there would be a bit more conversation about it in the media because Trevor's just a bigger name than Kyler. And no, I wouldn't say Trevor so far has been better than Kyler in his career. I would just say name value wise, you can make the argument Trevor's been a bit more of a more dominant name than a guy like Kyler. Now, in terms of the other categories, in terms of team success, I do expect Jacksonville to have a bit of a bounce back year. Their roster's for the most part pretty talented with a lot of nice pieces here and there. Definitely far and away from being an actual title contender, but I think with Liam Cohen, getting Travis Hunter, improving the offensive line, having some other positions where you feel a bit more better about, I do think Jacksonville could be a nice competitive team next year, that if they somehow do end up winning the division over a team like Houston, I do think that would ultimately kind of tick that box for Trevor Lawrence. Now, in terms of statistics, I would say Trevor's had a fine start to his career. His best year is in 2022, where he had 4,100 passing yards, 25 touchdowns, and 8 picks. For him to get to that MVP conversation, he'd have to have probably more like 4,500 plus, which I do think with Travis Hunter, with some of the new pieces on that offense, and a full season healthy from Trevor, we could maybe expect him to get to that 45-ish number. And if he gets to that number with 25 plus touchdowns and less than 10 picks, I feel pretty confident that he could have the statistic numbers to match up with a Josh Allen or a Lamar or somebody like that. And again, because he is a quarterback, there's always going to be a bit more value to his position. So I think with Jacksonville, because they are a team that isn't just fully talented and has like the biggest names, like I mentioned with Brock Purdy and that Niners team, I do think that you can make the argument that if Trevor has a big year, like I've mentioned, the team has some level of success, maybe they win the division, you could maybe make the argument that his value to a roster could be just as much as a lot of other quarterbacks out there. I think this is probably the biggest projection of this video, with some of these other guys on this list having a lot more provenness to them. But if there was a guy who I was projecting to get himself into those conversations, I do think Trevor would probably be one of those guys. Let's go to move over to number 3. I have Matthew Stafford. Now, he's by far and away the oldest player of this list, and in fact, he's one of the older quarterbacks in the NFL at this stage. But I think at this stage of his career, Matthew Stafford has still been, one of the best quarterbacks out there. Now, he has had amazing statistical seasons all the way back in 2011, had a 5,000 passing yard year. 2012, a 4,900 yard season. 2021, a 4,800 yard season with 41 touchdowns in that season. Obviously has had some statistical years that would arguably put him in those high level All-Pro, Pro Bowl, even sometimes probably argument-wise could have been an MVP conversations just based off the statistics. But I do think one thing that has kind of held back Matthew Stafford, especially in those early years in Detroit, was of course the fact that the team's success was just not there. Now in 2021, I do think that was his best year to potentially win the award, but that was also the year that ultimately Aaron Rodgers would go on to win the award, where he had 4,100 passing yards, 37 touchdowns, and just 4 picks. So he had just as good of a year as Matthew Stafford, and I want to say that Packers team was maybe a little bit more successful in the regular season. Still, I think there should have been an argument for Matthew Stafford to win that award, just simply because statistically speaking, he was just as good, if not arguably better. With that said, with Matthew Stafford, I think there's a lot of things going his way. Then bringing in Davante Adams, to me, opens up this offense significantly. That, in my opinion, 2021 Rams team was the best version of this Rams team because they had a prime Cooper Kupp. They also had Odell Beckham, who I know was not the 2014 Odell we became kind of accustomed to, but he was such a nice presence as an outside receiver for that team later in the season that I feel like now that you bring that in with Puka Nacua kind of taking over a bit more of that Cooper Kupp-like role, although they play kind of differently, but he'll kind of play into that role. And Davante Adams, who to me is still a fantastic receiver, and for a lot of rosters out there could be their wide receiver 1. You also pair that with some continuity on the offensive line, a nice running game, and a defense that should take some nice steps forward. In general, I think this Rams team is built up for success this upcoming season. So in terms of team success, I think they're a likely team that's ultimately going to win the division. If they do win the division, let's say they win 12 to 13 13 games. I think that checks off that box quite nicely. Now, statistically speaking, these past 3 seasons, he has not been up to the level of that 2021 year. In the past 3 seasons, he has been dealing with some injuries from time to time. His best year was, I guess, 2023 since 2021, but he had less than 4,000 passing yards. So it is a little bit hard for me to project him to get over to that number that we need him to hit for him to ultimately be an MVP candidate. But we have seen the proof in the pudding with that 2021 year. And with this roster hopefully being able to stay healthy, with them adding a Devontae Adams, I think we could see a bit of a late little resurgence here from Matthew Stafford, where maybe he can get closer to that 4,500 plus passing yard level with a lot of touchdowns and the team success being behind him. And in terms of value to roster, yes, this team has a number of awesome players like Apuka, Devontae, Kyron, Jared Verse defensively, so on and so forth. Of course, he's a quarterback, so I'm not too worried about that problem. Again, this is not a San Francisco, which I'm just going to use for the rest of the video because of how just damn talented they were. And you could tell that Matthew Stafford's value to this roster is arguably just as important as like a Josh Allen or a Lamar Jackson. So I think he kind of has the potential to check off all those boxes. And because we have seen the proof in the pudding in years past of him just having some insane statistical years, I could see a world where Matthew does get to that level. Now, I think the one thing that does hold me back about Matthew Stafford is that he is a little bit, I don't want to say turnover prone, but his turnover numbers in terms of interceptions are typically a lot higher than what you would want for an MVP. In that 2021 year, he had 17 interceptions. So I do think if he has over like 12 interceptions next year, even if he has like a 4,600, 40 passing touchdown season, I don't think he'll be seriously considered for the award just because of those turnovers. But I do think if he can keep the turnovers down and if he can have a statistical year, as I've mentioned, I think there's a strong argument that Matthew Stafford could be in the conversation. Also, name value wise, the big city of LA, he has all that going for him. And I also think there's a nice story here too for him. This is the best roster he's arguably ever been on outside of that 2021 year. They're going to be potential favorites to win it all this year. And also, he's Matthew Stafford. He's a kind of a historic quarterback. He's been in the league since 2009. Maybe there's a little bit of some motivation to give him this award if he has a nice year, especially because there might be a little bit of some voter fatigue on a Lamar, a Mahomes, or a Josh Allen. So potentially we could kind of see a little bit of a path here for Matthew Stafford. Just kind of throwing that all out there for you. Let's go and move over to at number 2, I have Dak Prescott. Now, a lot of my conversation and argument that I'm going to have for Dak Prescott is based off what we saw in that 2023 season and in some points in that 2021 season as well. Because outside of those years, he has been a little bit inconsistent and he's also just really been struggling with injuries these past few years. But over the course of the last 4 seasons, in the 2 years that he's been fully healthy, Dak Prescott has been a top 10 level quarterback and has put up some statistical numbers that are very, very impressive. I want to take you back to 2023, where at the time, Lamar Jackson won the MVP, but Dak Prescott was second in MVP voting and had a nice argument to be made that maybe he should have won that award if the later half of that season would have went a little bit nicer for him. Again, focusing on 2023 here, 4,500 passing yards, 36 touchdowns, 9 picks. The team was very successful. I think they won like 12 games that year. So they made the playoffs. I want to say maybe they won the division. Don't quote me on that, but I think they did. So a lot of things was going for Dak Prescott there. He also has by far and away probably the biggest name value on this list of him being the Dallas Cowboys quarterback. So there's a lot of things kind of working nicely in that 2023 season. And as we head over to 2025, I don't think the Cowboys are as talented as they were in that 2023 season. But I do think there's a lot of things kind of working in favor of Dak to potentially be in conversations for this award. For starters, having CeeDee Lamb, having George Pickens, to me, is one of the best wide receiver duos in the NFL. We haven't seen Dak Prescott have an offense with this much weaponry in the receiving core since like that 2021 season where they had Amari Cooper, they had CeeDee Lamb, and at that point, Michael Gallup was still a quality receiver in the NFL. And in that year, he had maybe arguably one of his more impressive statistical seasons. So in terms of statistics, I do think we have seen the proof that when Dak is healthy, he can put up the numbers to ultimately get the award. 2023, 4,500 passing yards, 36 touchdowns. 2021, 4,400 passing yards, 37 touchdowns. Even taking you back all the way to 2019, 4,900 passing yards and 30 touchdowns on top of that. So if Dak can stay healthy this year and have a statistical year where he gets over 4,500 passing yards, probably likely over 30 touchdowns as well, I think those numbers are good enough to get you to that point. The one thing that I do have pause with Dak Prescott on winning this award is the team success factor, because this is going to be a very tough division to win. You have Philadelphia, you also have Washington. So I think Dallas is going to have to be working within the wild card. But let's say Dallas has a 11, 12 win season. Dak has impressive numbers. I think those two kind of boxes are somewhat checked off. And in terms of overall value to a roster, he's a quarterback. He's the quarterback of not just any team, but the Dallas Cowboys. And given the fact that I think he's going to get plenty of opportunities to throw the football because the running back room behind them is not very good, and there's a lot of questions with the offensive line, you can make the argument that Dak Prescott is going to have to play insanely well and be a huge value to this team if they're going to get to that 11-12 win mark and Dak to have those numbers. I think there's also a lot of motivation to get Dak this award because, again, of that voter fatigue for some of those other quarterbacks. The 2023 year where there's a lot of motivation to give Dak the award then, but he just fell a little bit short. And because he is the quarterback of America's team, the Dallas Cowboys, there could be a bit of some voter pressure to get this guy the award for those reasons. Again, I'm not saying they're just going to hand him the award. He has to earn the award. But let's just say in a hypothetical scenario, it comes down to Josh Allen, Dak Prescott, and Lamar. They all have very similar statistic seasons. They each have regular season success very similar to one another. And I think if you're just trying to make the conversation as to why a guy like Dak should win over them, well, I guess the argument would be that he hasn't won the award and he's playing on a worser, that's not a word, but a worse talented roster than those guys. So again, just kind of trying to create the scenario needed for Dak to win the award. But with that all said, let's go ahead and move over to my number one candidate to win the MVP as a dark horse, and that is going to be Jared Goff. Now, Jared Goff, statistically speaking, has had the numbers the past 3 seasons to be considered for an MVP spot. 2022, 4,400 yards, 29 touchdowns. 2023, 45, 30. Last year, 4,637 touchdowns. I think this Lions team is very talented and there's a lot of great pieces around him. And I think his value to this roster, it's going to be at an all-time high, given the fact that you lose your offensive coordinator in Ben Johnson as well as your starting center. And yes, you have Amon-Ra, Jameer David. You still have a great offensive line and some great pieces around him. But I think with those other kind of factors taken into account, you can make the argument that this year for Jared Goff, he's going to have to be the biggest reason for why this Lions team can take that next step. Like you look at those Rams teams a few years ago where Jared was statistically awesome, but the value of him on that roster was not as much. Again, kind of the Brock Purdy scenario here, where Brock might have incredible numbers, or Jared in this case, but the overall talent around him is just so great that it's really hard to pinpoint the value of him on that roster. And again, I think that will be a bit of a hard conversation to have if it does kind of come down to nitpicking for the MVP award, because Detroit's a damn good roster with a lot of great pieces. So his value won't be seen as much as like a Lamar or Josh Allen or any of these other guys on this list. But I do think because of some of those other little issues that happened this offseason, his value is going to increase. When we talk about team success, I think the team should be really good next year. They're one of the favorites to win the NFC, and rightfully so. This is a team that's going through a lot of changes, so I could see some volatility at some points, but they have some tough matchups this year. If they can win some of those tough matchups, I think you're going to have the argument for the team success factor being checked off. Statistically speaking, he's had the numbers for several years now, and I think his numbers should just be even better, if not around the same next year, so that's checked off. And because I think his value is increasing, I also do think that that checks off the value question. Now, in terms of name value, I don't think Jared Goff has the same name value of a Matthew Stafford or even a Dak Prescott, because I think a lot of people, hold those quarterbacks in pretty high regards. Because his name is Jared Goff, because we kind of have a bit of a stigma with him, I could potentially see a world where the name value isn't as high, but the team value is there. A lot of people love the Lions. The conversation is kind of similar to Dak, where, he's been in the league since 2016. He hasn't won the award yet. If it comes down to kind of picking straws between him, Lamar, Josh, and all the other, highly likely guys to win the award, you could argue make the conversation that Jared Goff should get the award because of some voter fatigue and other factors like that could help him win the award. I also just think Jared Goff's a damn good quarterback, and I think it'd be really cool to see him win the award. Heck, I think it'd be cool if any of these guys, including the honorable mentions I mentioned earlier, could win the award too. I think Jared Goff is a very likely candidate. He's been in the conversations at some spotty points throughout the season. If they can have a consistent 2025 year, they have the team success, they have the statistics, and his value's there, I can see a world where Jared Goff gets into those conversations. But you let me know in the comment section below. Let me know your favorite to win the award, and also let me know your favorite dark horse contender to win the award too. And if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button. Love you guys. Peace.